Good afternoon, everybody. Our program will begin in just about 1 minute.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the BBB Charity Effectiveness Symposium. This is our 15th one. Today's theme is Building Bridges, Powering Your Mission Through a Time of Transition. And Walter, do you want to move that next slide? Thank you. I'm Claire Rosenzweig. I'm President and CEO of the Better Business Bureau of Metropolitan New York, as well as its affiliate, the Education and Research Foundation of the BBB of Metropolitan. Go ahead, Walter. Might as well continue. I want to thank our sponsors, our patron sponsor, American Express, our major sponsor, the New York Community Trust, our benefactor sponsors, PNP Staffing Group, as well as PwC, and our symposium friend, BDO FMA, as well as our event supporters, which you can see listed here. We want to thank them for helping get the word out about this online program. We hope next year to be in person, but thank you, event supporters. This program ties back to our BBB Charity Accountability Program. All total, between all of the local BBBs that do it, about 64 programs in total, including the Wise Giving Alliance, we have about 11,000 charity reports online that help consumers find charities that they can trust. A few housekeeping notes. Please evaluate today's program at the end. We actually use all of your input to help plan the next one. And we have hashtag BBB Charity that you can use today, and we really encourage you to tweet away about the program. I also encourage you to save the date, March 24th. We have Sustainability Strategies and Tactics, a webinar that afternoon. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Tanuja Daney, President and CEO of the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation. Over to you, Tanuja.
Hello, thank you, Claire. It is an honor and I am humbled to be here. Thank you for the opportunity today for me to share some lessons learned from this pandemic and these crises. So I'm the President and CEO of the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation. And so let me first begin a little bit with a description of myself for those with some access needs. I'm a cisgender female. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I have brown skin and black eyes and long black hair. I'm wearing an orange dress with a blue suit jacket. And I also invite you into my home. I am Zooming here from Central New Jersey. This is my work office. It has become my vision board. I have quotes, inspirational quotes, and pictures of those who inspire me. I invite you in because this is one of the ways that we can connect. One of the things that I want to share with you too as we connect together today is that I am a working mother of 5 children. 4 of my kids are in other rooms, staying very, very quiet right now, I hope, and hopefully off the internet for just their lunch hours so we don't break the internet and I can stay on with you. My 4 children here are in the public schools in New Jersey, and I am grateful every day to their teachers and educators who make it possible for them to have a good education where they are cared for each and every day. My oldest child is in college, and we are grateful that he was able to launch and actually have a college experience. As Claire mentioned, and as the screen shows here, I'm the President and CEO of the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation. I'm also a public company director. I've been on 4 public company boards. I serve on 2 now. I speak quite a bit and share my learnings on environmental, social, and governance issues, and a proponent of board diversity and inclusion and what that might look like and how we might practice that in our day-to-day in the corporate boardroom. I straddle a lot of different worlds. I'm in the corporate space, I'm in the not-for-profit space. I was also a former energy executive. And I have the privilege now at this point in my life to really examine the intersections and the connectivity of all of these worlds that I straddle. I tell some folks that I dream in Venn diagrams sometimes because that's where the intersections are and that's where the magic happens. So why do I share all this about myself with you? This is the first lesson learned from this pandemic. We make connections. We have to invite people in. We have to share a little bit about ourselves that maybe we didn't before. We have to share some of our humanity and make those connections with each other. So I am grateful for that. And I also ensure that we have to make some space for some joy, make some space for each other in this pandemic. One of the other lessons that I've learned from this pandemic and over this year is that while we're so far apart and socially isolated, that we need to figure out ways to connect with each other. And we have to make the time to pause, to share a little bit about each other. One of the things we do with the Dodge Foundation, which has become part of our rituals, is that we make time, some moments for movement and for breath work. And we also take some time to have some moments of Zen and connect. So I invite you on a little journey with me today. Everything's new, we can change the rules. A keynote doesn't need to be a traditional keynote. Normally I would be walking in front of you and making eye contact and smiling, and maybe some of you would be smiling at me and giving me reassuring glances, but it's just not that way. And so we have to adjust and adapt. So I invite you on a little journey to come with me right now, because this pandemic has hit every single one of us in so many different ways. We grieve those we've lost. We are grateful. And there are these moments of bright spots. So I invite you to come with me, bear with me, come with me in this journey. I guarantee, well, I think you'll feel better after the end of it. So I invite you to just close down your eyes for just a moment and take a deep breath in and take a deep breath out. First, just a moment, a brief moment to honor and to grieve those we have lost. Family, friends, strangers, hundreds of thousands of lives lost. Let's take a moment just to grieve together in this collective. Take a deep breath in and take a deep breath out. Now let's take a moment to honor with gratitude our heroes, our healthcare heroes, our educators, teachers, our frontline workers, perhaps those who keep the lights on. How about those who pick up our garbage and our trash and recycling? Who are your heroes? Let's honor them with gratitude. Let's take a deep breath in and take a deep breath out. And now let's honor and acknowledge that while the light may be emerging at the end of this tunnel, when we emerge together as a society, nothing will be the same. And perhaps let's honor that that is a good thing. And finally, I invite you just on your own, just to go inward for a moment. And just think of one thing that gave you joy this last week. A small thing, Maybe it's just a bird chirping, a sign of spring to come. Maybe it was a Zoom celebration of a big birthday. Whatever it is, hold on to that and now smile. From the corner of your mouth to the corner of your mouth, and as you open your eyes, smile with those eyes, as Tyra Banks would say, smize. And I ask you, to yourself, notice how it makes you feel. Because while this crisis has been hard, and many of us have been hitting the COVID wall, there are those moments of joy. And we should embrace those moments of joy. So that's lesson number 2. Make space for grief, make space for gratitude, and make space for joy. Which brings me to my 3rd lessons learned, something that has given me joy this year in unexpected ways. Some collaborations and connections and new friends. So as we've heard, with crisis also comes opportunity. And in the state of New Jersey, across the country, across the globe, people have come together. And in New Jersey, during the crisis, actually the very beginning of it, just about a year ago, many organizations and individuals came together and created pooled funds to address fundamental critical needs in the state. The Dodge Foundation participated and invested and made grants into a number of these funds. And we also participated in the grant making processes and the cycles so that we could learn not only where the dollars were going and what needed to be supported, but who was being left behind. So I wanted to just share one such pooled fund that I have spent a great deal of time on, and so has Dodge staff and board in the grant making process. And that's the New Jersey Pandemic Relief Fund, founded by the First Lady of New Jersey, Tammy Murphy, who brought together a diverse group of individuals, corporate funders, family foundations, private foundations, independent funders, as well as community leaders to come together for one basic purpose and cause, and that is to meet the needs of the state. The fund has raised over $60 million and distributed funds to close to 400, actually more than 450 organizations statewide. What emerged for me as a participant in this program, in this collaboration of a diverse group of individuals, was one that we all put aside kind of our own agendas. We have programs and things that we work on and focused in on what the community needed and to hear and listen. In our first round of grant making, we reflected and we realized that there were whole groups of people being left behind. And the fund created a cash assistance program for immigrant families. The Dodge Foundation participated additionally in that program for the very reason is that that is not our area of expertise, and we were not equipped to be able to provide that cash assistance as quickly as needed to be done. But the fund had created that infrastructure. And with a great deal of humility and learning and respect, it was an opportunity to step aside and take ourselves, the Dodge Foundation, out of the center and to really let the infrastructures and the work and the people who know what they're doing, to be perfectly blunt, to do what they need to do. This is one of those lessons we're learned that we're taking with us at the Dodge Foundation. The second example of collaboration that I'd like to share is the formation and the creation of the first of its kind New Jersey Arts and Culture Recovery Fund. Our neighboring states have these funds, but New Jersey did not have one. Early on in this pandemic, Sharnita Johnson, Program Director for the Arts for the Dodge Foundation, came to me with an idea to create a fund for the arts and culture sector, to support the arts and culture sector. Now, arts is one of the areas that the Dodge Foundation has supported over the last 45 years. And we quickly saw and realized with venues closing, theaters closing, that arts and culture workers were particularly being hit hard, that we needed to support them and figure out a way to do so. Sharnita, with other arts leaders, such as the Grennan Foundation, New Jersey State Council of the Arts, and many others, came together quickly to create this enduring fund for the state of New Jersey for the first time. As my colleague Sharnita tells me often, what is once lost will never return. And we know with the arts and culture and how important this sector is in the healing in this recovery after this pandemic, we can't let these unique cultural assets disappear. And so when I look and think about, in hindsight, this pandemic, one of the bright spots are this collaboration. And the last point I would make on connections and collaboration are the friends I've made, the co-conspirators, those who have inspired me. I started in the role of the Dodge Foundation in September of 2019. There was just a couple of months and I was being onboarded and learning the ropes and how things work. As I had mentioned earlier, I'm a lawyer by training. I did not grow up in the philanthropy space, and I had and continue to have a lot to learn. But when you have a lot to learn, you can come to the table with a great deal of humility and some self-awareness of what you don't know. But this pandemic hit and everything changed, as we all know. And while I had the chance and the opportunity to meet quite a few folks in person, as we know, when you meet folks in person, how fun that is. And yes, I crave it too. I want to go back to that. Don't get me wrong. You can maybe meet 1 or 2 people a day if you're lucky, but you also have to do your work. This pandemic, this Zoom environment that we're all in, I've met countless folks over the last year. Countless folks who have inspired me, who have taught me, who have become my friends and mentors, and I am so grateful for them. But one thing I would just share, and I think, and I'm guessing many of you have experienced this yourself, is that before we even start a meeting or a Zoom, we just say, how are you? How are you doing? And checking in and just making sure that we're all okay. And then really building some of those connections, those folks that you would never even realize you've met for the first time, may have gone to the same high school as you did in a completely different state. And those commonalities and those bridges are what's so special. And so while I'll be the first to admit that, this COVID wall is hitting me, these 4 walls sometimes are closing in, I am quite grateful for the friends and co-conspirators that I have made over this last year. Which brings me to the last point I'd like to share. With crisis does bring opportunity. This was a catalytic year for the Dodge Foundation. The pandemic, of course, back in March, the Dodge Foundation quickly moved, scraped every last dollar out of our budgeting to make immediate COVID-19 phase 1, what we call phase 1 urgent grant making. And we pivoted. We followed the Council of Foundations guidance to shift our grant making to general operating support. We moved grants up. We created a strategy, a COVID-19 strategy, and then crisis continued to hit. And in June of 2020, when many organizations were issuing statements in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, and we're trying to figure out ways to stand together. The Dodge Foundation was ready. We did not want to make a performative statement. We've been on a Dodge equity journey for almost 5 years. We were ready to take a stand and put words to action. We were ready to do this. We were positioned to do so with our 5 years of work. And so in the 2020, Imagine a New Way was born. What we realized was that this work of anti-racism, racial justice, and equity requires a reset. What we realized from this pandemic is that we will not and we cannot go back to the way things were. The disparities have been laid bare, and we needed to do something differently. And so Imagine a New Way is Dodge's transformation. It's our vision for the future. And it's big and it's bold, and we will not be able to do this by ourselves. Imagine a New Way has two interrelated parts. First is our commitment to anti-racism and centering our work on racial equity and justice. That is our work. The second component is our transformation, as well as the role we play in changing the philanthropic model by democratizing power, redistributing wealth, and shifting economic control that is just, regenerative, and restorative to the community. We were inspired by the resonance framework from justice funders. We were also inspired by the just transition framework from Movement Generation. We've been leaning into and living many aspects of trust-based philanthropy principles, but we're leaning in hard with participatory grant making. In January of 2020, we had 2 new members of the team join us with a social justice background. Vice President of Programs, Mariana Schaefer, and Vice President of People, Culture, and Equity, Janine Tierney. And together we at the Dodge team, which includes our board, are in the midst of this transformation, in the midst of resetting, redoing, doing new, imagining a new way, as we think about how we, an organization that has done important work for the last 45 years, will center our work on racial equity and justice. And this is no easy feat. We know that we can't do this alone. We know, as part of changing the philanthropic model, that we need to take ourselves out of the center. It is not about us. We also know and recognize that we need to think about bringing all of our resources to bear, including our endowment, as we democratize power, redistribute wealth, and shift economic control. And we have a lot of work ahead of us, and it will not be perfect, and we know that. And we also recognize that we have a 45-year history of doing important work. We support arts and education, environment, informed communities, the largest poetry festival in North America, as well as a technical assistance program. And how do we marry these two together to make the greatest impact in the state of New Jersey and perhaps beyond? And we also know that we need to share our story and engage in a dialogue with community as well. And it won't be easy, but that is okay. And that brings me back to the first two, actually the 3 lessons. We need to continue to invite people in and connect in new ways. We need to make space for grief and gratitude and joy. And we need to continue to collaborate and find new friends and new co-conspirators with us. And we know we need to take the time, but we also know that we have to put actions to words. And so with that, I'm going to share a quote from Audre Lorde, who's right behind me, a quote about joy. The sharing of joy, whether physical, emotional, psychic, or intellectual, forms a bridge between the sharers, which can be the basis for understanding much of what is not shared between them, and lessens the threat of their difference. So I thank you today for the opportunity to share a little bit about myself, to invite you into my home here. I'm grateful for the Dodge board and staff. I'm grateful to all of you. And most of all, I'm grateful to my kids and my dog for keeping quiet for the last 20 minutes or so. So with that, we're going to open it up for questions. Thank you so much. So I am looking for some questions here. I want to make sure I'm following the technology. So one of the questions is how to foster collaboration with other organizations. And I think that's just, first of all, it's how you enter the conversation with an open mind and an open heart, to have a strategic partnership and conversation with an intention that we're here for the greater good. I think one of the bright spots of the year for me was where there was the conversations became less transactional. And I want to move away from that, because it shouldn't be transactional. We're joining a movement, and the movement's bigger than all of us. And so together and collectively, that's how we can make a difference. And so I think that, some of the conversations and collaborations that I've had over the recent months have just been so joyful in that regard, because we're in it together. Some more questions. What are some examples of effective board staff collaborations that you can highlight at this time of transition? So I can just give one example that we're trying at the Dodge Foundation that it seems to be working pretty well. So we're really trying to establish what we just call the Dodge Squad. That's board and staff together, really effectuating this transformation, because we all need to be doing this together, rowing in the right direction. The first thing I would just share is that as part of our technical assistance program, we've offered an anti-racism, anti-oppression workshop. I should say it's called a Learning to Applied Practice. It's over a 5-month period of time. The architect is Yancey Consulting, and they've been working with us in this program and this curriculum. Close to 400 individuals in the state of New Jersey are participating in this program. That includes board and staff of close to 130 organizations are part of this 5-month-long Learning to Applied Practice. This includes the Dodge board and staff. And together, we're on this learning journey together, and having these conversations in breakout groups, just like our grantees are as well. One of the things we've also done is to foster trust and relationship building. We've started to have what we call pairs and triads conversations, where staff members are paired up or in triads with trustees to answer a bold question about our strategic vision, about Imagine a New Way, and about what we're also calling in 2021, build the new, live the new, and change the rules. And the goal is not to come up with a solution or the declaration. The goal is to hear each other and to listen to each other and hear each other's big ideas. And we've been doing this since September of last year, and the feedback has been resoundingly positive about how powerful it is to just get to know each other on this one-on-one or two-on-one basis. So we're going to be continuing to do that. And we also make space in board meetings. Board and staff are included in our board meetings to have these generative, open conversations where they're pretty low stakes, to be perfectly honest. We're not making decisions, we're getting to know each other. Let me see, I'm looking for questions in. Major transitions require major changes, which inevitably encounter resistance. Could you address how we might deal with resistance? That's a tough one. I think it's one that I grapple with all the time. I have to kind of check myself and my own resistance. And why am I pushing back, or why am I reacting in a certain way? And why do I do that? Because I own it. I have to own it. And so that's why I take the time to, try to instill a culture of self-care at the Dodge Foundation. I think we're getting better. We've really started in January with being intentional about self-care and self-awareness, because as many of you who meditate or practice yoga, know, is that so much of how we react to the world is how we show up. And but we can only do that from a place of inner strength and inner wisdom, inner reflection. So how do I manage with resistance? It's first kind of owning it, recognizing it, naming it, and then trying to work past it. But I can't say that I'm always successful. It's still a work in progress. But I think trying to be transparent and honest and authentic doesn't hurt. So many questions here. How are other foundations responding to the call for race equity? That's a great question. I would say that at least in New Jersey, it seems that several foundations, I would call them, they're my co-conspirators, are coming together to find ways to advance specific issues addressing racial equity issues and structural racism in the state of New Jersey, and coming together because we know that our collective impact is going to be greater than any individual funder. I will be perfectly honest, I take the lead of Kiki Jameson from the Fund for New Jersey. The fund has been a leader in this space, and the fund is really amazing at modeling collaboration and bringing funders together and figuring out ways to really amplify the work. And I would also say that in the state, the Council of New Jersey Grantmakers has a racial equity task force. I think the work is advancing. We're finally talking about it, and we're saying the uncomfortable words and leaning into it. I wouldn't say all foundations, it's just there's some foundations really are. Let me see, there's lots of questions here. Audience member has said, so grateful to hear you quote Audre Lorde. She's right here, right behind me. Can you describe some emerging strategies for carrying your organization forward through and beyond the pandemic? So we're going to be trying a lot of different things. When we say we want to democratize power and shift economic control and wealth redistribution, I'll be honest with you, that is part of a longer term plan. We're not going to be able to get there overnight. The way to get there is to take some steps. And so what we're hoping to do this year is try some participatory grant making processes with some funds that we've carved out, where we will, test some initiatives on nominations, test some ideas around having a community strategy team, advisors to help us make sure that are we on the right track to test the theories. We have 4 phases that we're thinking about the work. The first is called learning and exploration, where we, at Dodge, as part of our own internal culture shift, are doing the learning and the work and the research. And the second is what we're calling community engagement. And that is, bringing in community members, going out to community, testing the ideas, course correcting, shifting. And the third phase is change management and communicating with the appropriate stakeholders about what is coming as soon as we know it, with transparency as to the best of our ability. And then the last phase is implementation. And these phases are kind of sometimes on top of each other, and learning and exploration and community engagement just continue through the entire process. We're also thinking about taking a playbook from trust-based philanthropy principles, longer-term multi-year funding, and multi-year funding, as well as some capacity building. We have a robust technical assistance program, but we also recognize that capacity building, in a different way of thinking, is to provide the organization the self-determination to figure out what do you need and to figure it out. And here's some funding, whether it's for well-being, whether it's for your own strategic planning, but you decide. It's not for us to decide. I'm getting the 5-minute warning, so let me see, maybe one more question. Question from the audience: how do we stop just speaking solely or mostly with ourselves? And what strategies has the project developed to be truly inclusive? That is a great question. And I'll be honest, I look to so many other organizations and who have come before us. Again, I say we're joining this movement to model from their inclusive practices. I will say that this is something we're working on at Dodge. We have, we know our networks, and we have a duty to use our power and our influence and our voice to bring teams and folks together. I think the hard part is to, because the power dynamics, to get out of the way. So bringing organizations and groups together, and then stepping aside and letting the groups figure out what the issues are and what the problems are to ensure the solutions are relevant and accessible. We haven't done that yet. We're talking about that, and we're trying to figure out how best to do that, because by virtue of calling and bringing in networks together, they're already within the Dodge sphere of influence. So how do we expand that? And how do we do this in an appropriate way? We're still figuring all of that out. But one of the things I'm really pushing, it's my job to do so, is let's try, and it may not work, and try something else. But we have to start, and we have to start now. So that's in full humility, we have a lot of work to do there. I think it's time to turn this back to Claire. We're at the time frame, so thank you so much. So grateful to be here. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Tanuja. Imagine a new way. I think we're all trying to do that. So really appreciate this presentation and the conversation. It's been great. And that leads us into our next presentation. And again, Walter, for some reason, it's not working on my end, so thank you. I'd like to introduce our panel moderator, Yancy Garrido, Senior Program Officer of the Clark Foundation. And with him today are Dr. Jeremy Cahombin, President and CEO of the Children's Village, Sheena Wright, President and CEO, United Way of New York City, and Dr. Roderick Jones, Executive Director, Goddard Riverside. And I'll turn it over to you, Yancy.
Welcome. Excuse me. Welcome all. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. Boa tarde. My name is Yancy Garrido. I'm the Senior Program Officer at the Clark Foundation. My pronouns are he, him. And for those of you who don't know, the Clark Foundation is a 5th-generation family foundation with its family seat in Cooperstown, New York, where I am right now. And has a long relationship with New York City and Otsego County, if you're in New York. The mission of the family really is to help people live independent and productive lives however they see fit. And we do that by supporting organizations that fund education programs, social service, as well as employment services. We are general operating support funders. 90% of our grants are general operating support. And we also provide capacity building assistance to our grantees and when possible in collaborations to the field. It's really been an interesting year for all of us. And as we arrive at the 1-year mark since the COVID-19 pandemic changed everyone's lives and fervent calls for racial equity once again emerged, I continue to marvel at the ability demonstrated by our nonprofit community-based organizations to manage through all crises, including these dual crises, and to ensure that delivery of high-quality programs still exists. Without a doubt, the sector's leaders were challenged, and we're going to meet some of them today, in ways they could not have imagined, from the shifting of most services to remote platforms, to the protection of all employees and clients from infection, to the creation of systems to support the trauma from loss that everyone has experienced. But they have prevailed and they've kept our social safety net intact. Now, as state and city revenue shortfalls continue to be announced on a regular basis by many government officials, administering social services has become a Sisyphean task. Nonprofits everywhere are dealing with an increased demand for services at a scale never imagined. At the same time, budget cuts that will impact the sector for many years threaten to dismantle the infrastructure that has made it possible to support communities during past crises, such as Hurricane Sandy or 9/11 in New York, or disasters in other areas of the country, such as wildfires, devastating hurricanes, floods, and even winter storms in unexpected places like Dallas, where my daughter lives, and we're just holding our breath about what's going to happen next. More closely to where I'm working from, for example, recently the current New York City mayoral administration reneged on deals to maintain annual cost of living increases and pay appropriate indirect costs in contracts, actually imposing retroactive cuts on services already delivered. Moreover, organizations also faced reduced flexibility over the past year from government agencies to be reimbursed for expenses related to remote work, to COVID, and other things. Also at the New York State level, nonprofits have suffered from the historic lack of investment in the sector. And up until a few weeks ago, the state had imposed a 20% withholding of payments to providers and localities. Yet nevertheless, our nonprofit executives found ways to make it all work and deepened the partnerships with their staffs, their clients, and their private supporters through innovative investments of time and resources in technology, advocacy, and equity. Nonprofit boards also learned to build upon their past risk assessment efforts to create new paths for sustaining their organizations. And this has resulted in an ongoing dialogue as to how one should manage moving forward in 2021 and beyond. So today we have the privilege of welcoming 3 nonprofit business leaders with extensive experience in building partnerships with the public, private, government, and community sectors. And we're going to discuss how we can best move forward in a post-pandemic world to ensure security, fairness in New York City, where millions of people continue to live below, at, or hover just above the poverty line. With us today, we have Sheena Wright, President and CEO of United Way of New York City, Jeremy Kahomban, President and CEO of Children's Village, and Roderick Jones, Executive Director at Goddard Riverside Community Center. They joined us to explore these themes and to share their insights and lessons learned that we hope nonprofit leaders anywhere can apply to their own work. So I want to thank the panel for being here. And before we begin our discussion, I'd like you all to introduce yourselves briefly and give some background into what your organization does. And let's start with Sheena.
Thank you so much, Yancy, and I am grateful to be here. That was a wonderful keynote, and I so appreciated the minute to breathe and think. Sheena Wright, I'm President and CEO of the United Way of New York City. The United Way of New York City is focused on economic mobility for low-income people of color in the city of New York. That's our mission, that's our aim. And we do that by being a backbone in networks of community-based organizations. We have 600 community-based organizations that we partner with on the ground. We connect them with companies. We have 300 corporate partners. And we're also one of the largest partners of a half a dozen city and state agencies. So our job is to connect the dots to make sure that we have actionable strategies to move the needle for these communities, and that institutions have the capacity and the resources to get the job done. So grateful to be here and a part of this conversation.
Thanks, Sheena. Jeremy, why don't we follow up with you?
Thank you, Yancy. Good afternoon. I'm Jeremy Kahumban, the president and CEO at the Children's Village. We're an organization that was founded in New York City in 1851. Still pretty New York City centric, but we go all the way up the Hudson County and all across New York at this point. We serve about 15,000 children and families every year. Many of them coming from the deep end of child welfare, juvenile justice, and the immigration systems. We have a small presence overseas, currently in Iraq, where we have been since 2008. When it comes to the work we do, we have a single focus, and that is that we believe that children need to live with family and people who love them unconditionally. We define family very broadly, just one person, one appropriate, reasonable adult that's willing to love a child unconditionally, and that they should not grow up in institutions, they should not grow up in systems, and they should not grow up in charity. So love and belonging is our mission. We have 1,400 staff and 27 trustees.
Thanks, Jeremy. Rod, why don't you share with us what you guys do?
Thank you, Yancy. So glad to be here with you all today. I'm Rod Jones. I'm the executive director at Goddard Riverside Community Center, and our history dates back to 1853. Today, we serve about 22,000 people every year, primarily at our 24 locations across Manhattan and now in Elmhurst, Queens. And we serve the entire lifespan. We like to say from cradle to grave. And we simply paraphrase, kind of describe our work as making investments in people to strengthen community. We believe that when individual people and New Yorkers are stronger, the broader community is stronger. And so our work is at two levels. One is we provide a variety of direct services to 22,000 people, as well as extensive advocacy for the causes that affect the lives and communities of the people we serve.
Thanks, Rod. Why don't we stay with you, Rod? Let's get the discussion started. Can you please share with us some of the immediate decisions that you and your organization made in response to the pandemic and the race equity crises?
Yeah, I think as was pointed out, we serve communities that are already very hard hit at the margin, and not just the people we serve, but the people who work for us that serve those folks. And so we had to make a number of key decisions, like redesigning program delivery, because we have a number of employees that are essential workers. Essentially, we could not have them call off work. We made some early decisions with our board and trustees to provide additional incentive pay, because our folks, even when they shut down the train stations, they had to get to work. So we had to implement additional support for them in terms of childcare, transportation, the incentive pay that they so deserve, because they were putting their lives out first, as well as making decisions about how our board used some of the dollars we had to cover the additional expenses and investment.
Thanks for that. Sheena, what were some of the decisions you all had to make?
Well, immediately, I mean, I think people are familiar with the role of United Way in a disaster, right? My first day on the job was actually the day Hurricane Sandy made landfall. And I think initially, this hit like just a disaster. But what we didn't know, right, is that it's a prolonged disaster. It's like Sandy's happening again and again and again. And so one of the first things that we did is what we certainly do and do well is we set up a COVID-19 relief fund. And really in a compressed amount of time, we were able to raise about $17 million to really invest in direct service organizations that are on the front lines and continue to be on the front lines of the pandemic, whether it was all of our emergency food programs that, you know, had to scale back because they had seniors that were at risk, but the demand was growing. Our education partners trying to figure out how to, you know, support teachers and families and children with what's happening in the school system. So that was a big body of work. And obviously, immediately after the COVID shutdown of the city, we had the very public murder of George Floyd, which really, you know, kind of brought out a whole nother level of conversation about racial equity and social justice. So for us, although we had never been as explicit as we are now, that our work is rooted in racial equity and social justice, it was really an opportunity to just be very clear about the work. And so we launched in the summer an effort called a Campaign for Equity. What we found was that so many of our corporate partners were making statements. Black Lives Matter. And yes, they do. But they also wanted to really align with, and now what do we do about that? How do we really manifest that in who we are as an institution? And how do we move the needle around justice and opportunity? And so we were able to really partner with many of those companies and really go on a learning journey around what are we talking about when we say racial equity? What does that mean? How does it impact you? What should you be doing? And so that is an effort that is significant and important. And I'm really happy that we are kind of steep in this. The other thing, and the last thing I'll say, I always want United Way of New York City to be what New York City needs us to be. You know, we operate with a framework, we build capacity in community-based organizations, we connect dots, and we, you know, certainly work in education, financial strength and stability, health, et cetera. But those needs change. And so what we found when, you know, COVID hit, George Floyd murder sparks a different kind of conversation. We were called on to do new things. So we had to stand up new initiatives. And two of them, which really capture both the racial equity and social justice moment and the COVID moment, are brand new. One of them is focused on health and the impact that COVID-19 is having on the Black community. Obviously, more deaths, more hospitalization, more vaccine hesitancy, not getting testing. So we launched an initiative in partnership with many others to focus on the Black community as a result of the impact on COVID-19. And the other is an initiative that is focused on our small businesses, which are devastated across the board. But we also appreciated before COVID-19 hit, only 2.5% of the businesses in the city of New York were Black owned. So this is an extinction level event for Black owned businesses. So we stood up an initiative that was focused on that. So being very responsive and really kind of just continuing the work that we've been doing.
Thanks for that detailed answer. Jeremy, your organization, in addition to decisions, how did your prior thinking and planning need to change in response?
It had to change. I think our most difficult decision on March 15th was the realization that we had to stay open. We had over 400 young people that were living with us in various programs, including mothers and children and young men and women who had been trafficked. We had another 1,500 children who were about to be home for something called remote education. No one knew what that meant then. And so we needed at least 800, I think Rod mentioned this. We needed about 800 staff that needed to come to work every day. And we went to our trustees and said, we can't ask 800 staff to come to work and the rest of us go home. That is not happening. So we went to the trustees and said, we need permission to stay open. We have doctors on staff, amazing doctors on staff, great nurses. We're going to deploy them into the communities that were hardest hit, as Sheena mentioned. You know, these were the same communities where our staff were coming from. That's where our parents and our children were living. I think we had to learn to be transparent quickly. In our residential programs, there is no social distance. You know, you come in, you have 14, 10, 12 teenagers that want your attention. And if you don't give them attention, they're going to get it from you, right? One way or another. And this was not because they just didn't care about social distance. Our young people were scared. They were watching the news. They knew who was dying. They knew people who were dying by name, including a 26-year-old young man that passed away. They were sharing this stuff on social media, going on Facebook, talking about the people that were dying in hospital. And so there was a lot of grief and a lot of anger and a lot of palpable fear. We had to just come out and acknowledge it every day. As guidance changed, everyone was learning this, especially, last March, April, May, right? We didn't know all that we know today. So we had to just get out there and sometimes say, we don't know. We don't know, but we'll figure it out. We had to also do the same thing with our foster parents. Our foster parents are pretty amazing, right? They're amazing people that make tremendous sacrifice to give young people home and love and work with families so they can go back to their own family. Overnight, our foster parents became stay-at-home educators, recreation therapists, technology experts, and grief counselors. And most of our foster parents, many of them were also in the same risk group of being older, living in these deeply segregated neighborhoods, caring for teenagers who didn't want to stay at home 24 hours a day for the next 3 months. So getting out to our foster parents and giving them extra support in ways that we never thought we'd have to became part of the decisions we had to make and the resources we had to expend.
A question for all of you. Along these lines, I can tell you as a philanthropist in the foundation world, we rely on your organizations to be the credible messengers of what's going on, so we know what's going on with the communities. Do you feel that you were those credible messengers for your clients, or were there changes you had to make to address that?
So I guess I'll jump first. I think Yancy, from our standpoint, what we find is our communities don't typically call the government or call schools, they call us. So not only does that inform us, but it then makes us responsible to act. So we found, I think, as Sheena points out, we found ourselves buying computers for kids when government couldn't quite get it right. So there's 5 kids in a house, they give them 1 computer. How does that work? Or the delivery of food to seniors. Even in the government's attempt to execute, it's us on the ground who understand how that execution is going and where the faults are in the system. And so that's a key part of our role, is to inform both philanthropy and government to say, this senior has 12 bean salads, or they have no meal today. And we typically, and that's true for the pandemic, had to realign our services to fill the gaps in the faults of government's effort. So whether that was kids and the equipment they need for school, we knew that they needed hearing apparatuses because you have 4 or 5 kids in one room trying to have class, or the delivery system was failing and people didn't have food. We had to open material assistant areas where we were paying rent. But we hear that on the ground because people come to us first.
Thanks for that. Do you want to say something, Sheena?
I mean, absolutely. And to underscore the importance of our organizations and other organizations like ours, government is a blunt instrument, and it's very difficult for government to deeply appreciate what's happening on the ground in neighborhoods and communities. I love that this panel was entitled The Bridge, right? We are the bridge. And it is so critically important, not just in a crisis, but every day, that that bridge is strong, that it is sound, because it just doesn't get done any other way. People are not reached any other way. And when you talk about trust, and certainly there have been so many challenges with government that, I mean, distrust, the school system, of, the health system, of across the board. These organizations, we are the ones where people go to day in and day out in partnership. And so it's critically important. And I also just wanted to note, as kind of looking around at our squares, that we are also people of color. And obviously the vast majority of the people that we are in service to are people of color. And that makes a difference too. When we are speaking about, some of the challenges or what we need to do, or really connecting the dots, there is an appreciation of who we are, and our history and our connectivity to the people that we serve as well.
Thanks. Just to tie in, Jeremy, if I may, we had an audience question about what skills did you find your staff needed to build to fully engage with communities during this time? And of course, you were going to say something. I don't want to cut you off there.
Yeah, I just want to add to the comments that Rod and Sheena made on government. I would say that, to many of us at this meeting today, government, especially good government, is helpful. But if you're poor and undervalued, even good government is incredibly burdensome. It is, as Sheena said, a blunt instrument. It's unpredictable to them. And even when good government is trying to do their best, it is burdensome. Just take a look at the vaccine rollout, right? The whole idea that, I can absolutely go online and get an appointment. I have technology, I know what to do, I know how to refresh my browser. So many of the families we serve have not been able to navigate that one website. We are the bridge.
Thank you for that. So let's go deeper on that, and then we'll get back to that other question in a second. Sheena, can you share with us how you found yourselves at United Way needing to refocus your mission or your work to address these fundamental systemic issues that have been exposed by the pandemic? And what practices you put into place at your organization with your board and staff to address it?
Well, as I said, one of the things that we needed to do was be more explicit that the work that we were doing was focused on racial equity and social justice. And we had to have a learning journey of our staff and our board to really understand, well, what does that mean? Because these are very charged terms, right, today. And whoever you are, there's a place where you sit when we're talking about racial equity in the history of this country. And so what we realized is that we really actually had to map out a learning journey. We held several town halls. We talked about, well, why do we have such disparities in academic achievement? Because we have an opportunity gap. And talking about how, funding for schools with children of color is much lower than funding for schools that serve white children. Why do we have the criminal justice kind of disparities that we have, and really looking at that history? We have like reading lists, and 3 books I'll recommend that I think are great. One is The Color of Law, and it talks about fundamentally how our results are based on laws, right? Redlining, federal policy that drew red lines around communities, that made sure that, based on race, that made sure that you could not invest in them. These are the same communities that we serve today. So really helping people understand The Color of Law. Caste, which is an amazing book by Isabel Wilkerson, which really looks at the United States of America and our racial caste system. And the last book I'll mention is The Sum of Us, What Racism Cost Us. Because the other thing that people had to appreciate, not only the history, but if we continue on this path, how detrimental it is to us as a society. So we were really intentional about that learning. And it was tough. People, were uncomfortable, were defensive. And it was a challenge. And it was also painful for many people as well. We had to hold space. And so for just kind of really work that out. And again, you know, being explicit externally about this is what we do. And the last thing I'll say, I'm glad that there's a new conversation about, you know, not about charity, but about justice, and how we need to really be thinking about our work collectively. It's just not about, you know, helping those that are less fortunate. How did they become less fortunate? Are they less fortunate? Or were there systemic policies that were put in place that got us these results? And actually, the last thing I'll say is advocacy. We have to be focused in investing on advocacy. Programs cannot fix what policy has forged.
Yeah.
And there's so much opportunity for systems change now with new government policies that we have to be at the table, and we have to make sure that that's resourced and there's a commitment to it.
So along these lines, it could be Rod or Jeremy, how have you had the difficult conversations with your boards and also give your staff the tools to deal with this either within themselves or with their communities as we look at this issue?
Rod, shall I go?
Please, Jeremy, I'll jump in after you.
I think with our trustees, there were a couple of things we had to do. Early on, as Rod mentioned, we did the same thing. We went to our trustees and said, our people who are making the sacrifice to be at work are at risk. And they need to take care of family. They are spending more on transportation. Let's do more. And, you know, it was a unanimous decision by our board once they understood it to pay everyone that came to work on March 15th. And we kept it through June 26th or 2020, 25% more. So over 800 employees got 25% more for every hour they worked, with the overtime included. And then another 300 they had the opportunity to be remote, but they also reported to work. We gave them 10% or 5% based on what the time they did. So that was a tough decision because we had no idea where that money was going to come from. But we felt that that was a moment when we had to make a decision. When George Floyd was murdered, I had the opportunity to reflect, and I think Sheena mentioned uncomfortable and personally uncomfortable, and to go before my staff and talk to them about my color not being a proxy for the historical injustice that African Americans have faced in the United States. So I get my color from an Asian father. And as an Asian family, we were often chosen and mentored and nurtured above African Americans. So growing up in the Midwest, I saw it. You know, I had plenty of African American friends that didn't get the attention that I got. I didn't understand it then. I understood it over the years as I grew up, but it came home to me on that day that the chances of me getting pulled over are pretty high, but of getting killed are pretty low. And, you know, people like me that have color should not forget that our color doesn't define the terrible history that we as a nation need to change. That was probably one of the more difficult days because I can talk all day long. I spent a couple of days talking to my 3 children and getting their guidance about how I would have that conversation. And it was a defining moment for me personally and for the Children's Village.
Yeah, I think I'll follow Jeremy's last point about being a person of color. So I have had those experiences. And so I've been pulled over wrongly, I've been misaccused. I mean, I've been there. And so for me, during that period, a lot of it was taking a moment to step back and be transparent with my staff, because every subgroup, we're pretty strong in advocacy, so every subgroup had their own version of this letter. And from my standpoint, it was important for me to help them to understand that Goddard as an institution is different than Rod as the person. And so there are a lot of causes I would love to crack the whip on, but the institution was before I came and has to stand when I go. In the end, through that process, it allowed for staff to share the reality of what it is to have very similar experiences. Because I think sometimes what happens is we all particularly tend to believe that if we get enough education or we make enough money that we're exempt. And so for some of our staff, it was a reality check that money doesn't make you not Black. PhDs out the wazoo doesn't make you not Black. And so it was a good opportunity to have a real conversation about the fullness of the experience, as well as to get clear around how the institution represents its position and cause. And like Jeremy says, some of that also had to do with a discussion around staff. Why are women and people of color the lowest paid people on the rank, but called on first to stand in line to put your life on the front line? And so those were hard conversations, but we were able to have them. And I think to Sheena's point, we were doing, we're grateful to philanthropy and our board. We were doing an incentive pay probably not later than the end of March of last year. But that was really about advocacy. It was about making a statement that it is unjust that it's like asbestos. You wouldn't pay an asbestos worker to risk their life to take asbestos out of a building at the same pay you would a custodian. And so what we find in our business is that most of the people who are working there are primarily women and then people of color. So from the point of advocacy, we decided that rather than proliferating letters that meant nothing, and I struggled, quite frankly, with some of the letters, and I thought to myself, I'm not doing this again. I've been here before. I'm not about to sit here and pen another letter that's empty. Either we're going to act or we're not going to act.
So, I mean, these are really, really, we're getting at the crux of what's going on now. So as we think about this and we think about the future and how to move forward, and to the themes that have been discussed so far about building bridges with other CBOs, governments, donors, what is the advocacy? I mean, what is the advocacy around digital divide? How do we get this addressed so both the communities and your staffs can really get the equity they need so they can participate in our society? What are those next steps that we can communicate? And why don't we start with Jeremy?
I think on the advocacy point, which is certainly the most important thing we need to carry forward here. The one lesson we learned from the pandemic that I never want to forget is that our people didn't need everything we had. We needed to give them what they really needed. As an institution, right? So we had residential programs, we have good clinicians, we have great social workers. What they needed was the sanitizer was out of stock. Everyone with money bought it. They didn't have money for Ubers. They were too scared to be in the subway. They couldn't get food. People with credit cards ran away, my family included, ordered everything they needed from Amazon. I mean, it was embarrassing. It still is. We have boxes and boxes and boxes. I have thousands of families that have no Amazon account, no credit card, and some of them don't have credit. They needed money. Many of them needed prescriptions. Many of us get our prescriptions delivered, but if you don't have an online pharmacy and a credit card, you're not getting prescriptions delivered. You needed someone to pick it up at a pharmacy and bring it to you. What they needed on March 16th was not what we were giving them on March 14th. Our people are not mentally ill. They're not broken. They have just been put down, locked into segregation, denied, disappointed, not mentored, not chosen, not encouraged. We need to do better. We absolutely need to do better. We need to give them money. We need to give them safe housing that's beautiful, that have terraces. I saw that every time I went to a Harlem building at 127th Street during the lockdown, because we have a clinic and a food pantry there. Everyone around me had to come out to the main road, or either 127th, 126th, or Adam Clayton or Lenox to get some fresh air. Our tenants had 2 terraces. one on the 9th floor and one on the 2nd, where they could use their key fob and go out, and that's affordable housing. There is absolutely no reason why affordable housing can't be beautiful and affordable, good enough for you and me to live in. It doesn't need to look the way it looks. We can do better.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, Yancy, yeah, I think to Shayna's earlier point, if we're going to get to real change, I think the first step is having a conversation in real practical terms around what we mean by terms. When we say equity, is it equity of opportunity or is it equity of result? And oftentimes, I think where we get into the push-pull is around not being clear around the emphasis on equity of opportunity. Because when you can get clear on that, then you can really talk about systematically what needs to be done to allow people to equitably participate. To Jeremy's point, we work in communities where, everybody's not sitting around on welfare as if they don't want to work. They go to work and they work a job or two. And even at that, when they get a degree without networks of access, they're not going to be highly employed. And if we talk about equity of opportunity, then we would start to ask critical questions in an employment environment like, how many people got their job because somebody told you about this job? Or how many people got the job because somebody referred you? And then the follow-up question to that is, how many people in this room know at least 10 people of color? And you'll quickly start to realize that the fault in equity is not even always deliberate, although we have a history of deliberate intent. Just the sleights of hands have to be corrected. And that will only happen when you bring government together with private industry and not-for-profits, because we understand and can articulate and translate the lived experience of the people that we serve. And it's that when we all get moving in the same direction around equity, then you don't have to talk about issues of government taxation increasing because everybody can participate in work. But the question of equity is the cornerstone, and then the systemization across the sectors is the second part of that.
So building on this point, Sheena, how do we move? You deal with a lot of corporations in your work, a lot of private donors. How do we move from this concept of charity to justice? Because our philanthropic system is built on this concept of charity.
No, absolutely. And I think there were just so many great things that Jeremy and Roderick just really highlighted. And I'd like to answer that question, Yancy, and kind of just pull on a few of the things that they said. When you ask, like, what are some of the policy things that we need to be focused on? So the policies that are focused on income, right? So wage policy, the examples that they gave about really valuing the work. We talk about essential workers now in this country, and these are some of the most underpaid, and they've been the most undervalued people, but truly valuing the work. As Roderick said, 83% of families before COVID-19 had somebody that went to work every day, but they still couldn't make ends meet. They were struggling with food. They were struggling with housing. 83% of people. And the thing that really scares me, there was an article on the front page of the New York Times, I think yesterday, that said, we're probably going to have a big bounce and go back into a quote unquote economic recovery. And I asked the question, for who? For whom? Are we going to go back to what we had? What are some of the policy things that we need to do now, just in terms of wage appropriateness, really making sure that the people are compensated fairly for their work so that they can live productively? Our education systems, the policies that create this completely disparate opportunities, how do we really close those gaps? Home ownership, affordable housing, all of those policies are ones that we have to be squarely focused on. And that's how we, I think, start to shift the conversation from charity. Again, those unfortunate people, like, I just feel so sorry for them. It's just, they had bad luck. No, they didn't just have bad luck. There were systems and structures, and we have to understand, I think philanthropy has to go on a learning journey. How did we really get here? And what has, what has all of our roles been in that? And then how do we then structure the remedy? Because what we do know, and what we do have to realize if we don't know, is that if we continue on this path, it's damaging for all of us. There are all these studies that have come out that said if we close, the racial equity gap in any of the areas I mentioned, it will contribute billions, I would say billions of dollars to our GDP. I mean, we talk about growth and recovery and financial stability for all of us. And when companies start to appreciate that, they're like, wait a minute, right? There's something to that. And it's not foreign to them. I mean, companies used to build workforce housing, right? MetLife built Peter Cooper Village in Stuyvesant Town because they appreciated that their employees needed, quality housing and places to live. So I think companies can do more as well in partnership with government and partnership with nonprofits. And the last thing I'll say is that what Jeremy and Roderick said about what's happening on the ground, how that has to influence policy. We often have this bifurcation of policy advocacy organizations up here and direct service organizations. We need to make sure that that connection exists. We need to make sure that direct service organizations have advocacy capacity and they're resourced to do it. And so that's also how we'll get to better results at the end of the day.
Thanks for that, Sheena. Actually, we're now at our time for questions and answers. This conversation has gone very, very quickly. And I want to pivot off of something you said, Rod, about that nonprofits really are well positioned to serve as a bridge between government, business, and philanthropy. And also to something that Tanuja mentioned, she was talking about in her own organization, they're looking at themselves internally. So we have a number of different participants today online who've asked if so you could all talk about the difference between serving communities of color and doing the difficult internal anti-racism work within your organizations when they're not necessarily led by communities of color.
We've actually been at this for about 12 years, and we just published some data. It's at Race to Lead. You can see what it's done. Internally, there are we think there are three things that absolutely define you. A, who do you promote? So who do you bring into the organization and who do you promote? Who do you mentor and who do you introduce to your network? At the Children's Village with our 1,400 employees, if you get introduced to me, if I choose you for a promotion, if I introduce you to my network, you're probably going to be okay, right? The next time a job opens up within the village or even outside, I'll probably give you a reference. When you look at organizations, it is easy to know who is doing the work by looking at who gets promoted, who gets mentored, and who gets networked.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jeremy. One of the things there's a couple of things internally that we focused on just very directly. When we hire and managers hire, we always take a look at what's the pattern of hiring. Are you replicating yourself? And that happens oftentimes. If we find that if there's a senior leader whose cultural ethnicity, she's a Jewish woman, typically people around her is a Jewish woman. If it's a Latino man, guess who's around that person? And so we start to ask questions very directly. How did the person get here? How did the candidate pool get to be what it was? And did you really select the most qualified person, or did you replicate yourself?
And I'll just add to that. I mean, one of the things that we've done is create a culture committee at the United Way, and it's a cross-functional team of people at all different, spaces in the organization who are really holding and helping us appreciate what we need to do in order to become an anti-racist kind of organization and really leaning into to social justice and racial equity. And so holding spaces, you know, we've been able to hold space for the team, and we have about 70 people, so it's not as large as the other organizations. It is diverse, and we've worked at that over time, but also to hold space. I mean, we had a session after a couple of sessions after the George Floyd murder, just to hold space for people to express how they were feeling. And some of our Black male colleagues expressed how they felt with their colleagues in ways that people had not appreciated. And so really to come to terms with that internally as an organization and to make space for that, these are important practices that we will certainly need to continue to move forward. And just whatever kind of race, ethnicity, gender you are, to be able to express how you're feeling in your skin around what's happening in the environment with the work at work is really important, and something that we want to continue as a practice and as a ritual in our organization.
Thanks for that, Sheena. We have a number of actual questions, and I can't really read it, whether it's skepticism or just, you know, wanting to know how. You know, we are talking about democratic values, but there are questions about, can the healing work really happen at the government level? Do we have hope for change within government and with all the civic divisions that we have right now?
Yes, we need to hope in government. We need someone at the top.
Yes. And I think if we appreciate more and more that it's our government, and we kind of lean into that, and I feel like there's so much energy generally in the broader populace of holding people accountable. And you know was so, I mean, the number of people that voted, right, had their voices heard, there's so much power in that. So you know, if we don't like it, we got to change it. And so that gives me hope.
You want to speak, Rod, or you're good?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that is not just, it's not merely leaving government to itself, though. That we have to collectively create the bandwidth to advocate, because we see it all the time, that where there's a strong lobby, there's decisions that are favorable. And so in our sector, this practice of blind charity, where it's only about the delivery of service and not about amplifying the voice and lived experiences of the people we serve, is part of that problem. Government can change, and they do make policies depending on the lobby, and we just simply don't make the investment in that space.
Thank you. I think those are great words. We're almost done. We're at our 2-minute warning. So let's do a lightning round. One lesson learned from each of you to share with everybody who's listening or watching us right now.
Give people
Jeremy?
what they need, not what we have.
Rod?
Be agile.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think systems thinking is critical, because we make it work together.
I want to thank you all. I've certainly learned a lot today. And I think we pass it over now to, I'm not sure, is it Claire? Who do we pass it over to now?
Yes,
Can I just
it
say,
is
Yancy?
me.
Oh, wait.
Can I just say, Yancy, you are the best. Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, well, thank you.
You're all the best, actually. Yancy, I want to thank you. All of you did. What a great conversation. You know, tying in, you know, imagining a new way, and how do we move from charity to justice? I mean, those are, everything that you said resonated, but those two lines, I just really rose to the top for me, tied together. So I want to thank you all. Thank you to all the attendees who asked questions. And now we'll move to our next speaker, who James Sheehan is Chief of the Charities Bureau at the Office of the New York State Attorney General. And I want to thank him so much for joining us today. Over to you, Jim.
First, I have to unmute. There we go. Thank you very much, Claire. I really appreciate it. And I think if you look at the theme of this presentation, that is all the presentations today, which is powering the mission through times of transition, it's important to look at the panelists that you've seen and the organizations that they come from. So for Roderick and for Jeremy, these are organizations that are over 100 years old that have been serving direct populations in New York City and New York State for that entire period of time. They look very different now than they did, but they represent an important tradition in New York State of charities that have long-term commitments to their mission and the people that they serve. And I think if you look at Sheena's organization, which started out as the Community Chest a long time ago, and how that has evolved and changed, and thinking about how do you fulfill your mission of your organization and recognize the importance of transitions and meeting the conditions that you have now. And Tanuja, of course, and Yancy both work for organizations which were founded by relatively wealthy people in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And they have done a process of strategic planning and thinking in order to evolve their mission over time to deal with the issues that we have now. And I think that's a continuing challenge for every nonprofit organization in the social services area in the current time, even more so. So let me, so Walter, can you help me with the slides because it's not bouncing. Thank you. So Attorney General Tish James has been in office now for over 2 years, very much committed to the nonprofit sector and to the social justice mission that many of the organizations have. And she's a pleasure to work for and very supportive. Walter, next slide. It's not moving. So the message I wanted to leave you with, of course, it says 2020 here, but we're now in 2021. We don't want to lose these organizations. We don't want to lose their mission. We don't want to lose their work. We were very concerned in March of 2020 because the average not-for-profit in New York State had 30 days of cash. And anytime you have a crisis like this, the question is what's going to happen as a result. And often we had heard before in other crises, I didn't sign up for this. That didn't happen this time. And we've been very impressed with that. And you look at all the issues that we are facing, the charity sector, and I apologize, Sheena, I use the charity sector just because that's the traditional term we've used. The social distancing was expensive and difficult. The compliance issues were difficult. For the first time, I drive through, I live 4 days a week outside Albany. And for the first time, I saw people lined up for food banks, often for 2 or 3 blocks at a time. And that's to me, a real measure of how severe this problem has been for people without assets and without support. Social services and health, the same situation. For the arts organizations and museums and other kinds of organizations, education organizations, no tickets, no admissions, no service fees, no tuition, cancellation of fundraising events, and the budget issues that Yancy, among others, talked about, and the consequences when governments cut their budgets and the services provided are not supported. And finally, the issue of habit and memory. How will people respond a year later when their habits of working with organizations and supporting them are affected by being locked in their houses for a year? Next slide, please. Walter, can you do the next slide? Thank you. So the misery loves company slide, that's what this one is. It has been worse. In 1919, there were 675,000 deaths from a pandemic. What was called the Spanish flu. That particular pandemic, if you had applied to the same population, would be almost 2 million people today. The president, and part of our problem, I think, is that it's not just the COVID-19, it's the governmental response and the background. President in 1919 had reinstituted segregation in federal government, and he told protesters that it's not humiliating but a benefit. And he also prosecuted a rival presidential candidate for sedition, and his Supreme Court upheld the conviction. There were peaceful protests in 1919 against racial violence, and they were followed by riots, but mostly by white people in over 30 US cities, and terrorism by white supremacist groups. Civil rights organizations wrote to that same president saying, "How long do you intend under your administration to tolerate anarchy in the United States?" He didn't answer. Next slide, please. And I think when you look at that history, one of the temptations is to say, well, we had a terrible administration and we had these problems, then we had a pandemic, so it's going to get better. And I think it will, but it's not going to. We're not going to get there without significant effort, and that's what the transition conversation is about. Stewardship in a pandemic, the focusing on their mission, thinking about preserving staff, facilities, and volunteers. And I thought Jeremy's conversation about paying your frontline people and finding ways to make sure that you continue the services is critical. Maintaining your reputation and goodwill. And then since I'm a government person, I have to say compliance with the law governing restricted assets, which is an issue in New York and in other states, to make sure they're used for the purposes they were intended. And that includes not only the restricted assets that are given, but PPP and the loans, and making sure you have records sufficient to support what the money was used for. Next slide, please. So if we think about transitions, and those transitions include preserving, protecting, and responding, one of the issues is risk assessment. How problematic is our current situation? And what are the threats to the organization and its mission and to the beneficiaries we serve, and how are we going to deal with them? One of the challenges we've seen is that some organizations are not going to survive the pandemic, and no one likes to see organizations disappear or be merged, but that's unfortunately what's going to happen, just because it's been so long and so hard. And in the college situation, right, there are colleges that have shut down, and we anticipate there may be more. And the issue there is to make sure that if that unfortunately should occur, what happens with respect to the students who are currently the beneficiaries of the organization. Affiliations, joint ventures, transfers, dissolutions, and donations of assets. If you can't continue to do the work that you have, how should those assets be used, and where should they go? And the program, we did a program this morning with Nonprofit New York on the issue of affiliations and joint ventures and mergers, and I'd suggest we also have materials on our website that discuss those issues. We're very concerned about, as I say, when we look at the numbers and we saw that the average nonprofit in New York had 30 days of cash, the question is, what do you do with that? And the challenge is, if you say publicly, and this goes for not just nonprofits that provide social services or the arts, but education institutions, if you say that they're 30 days away, that may discourage other people from supporting them or providing money or entering into contracts with them. So we try to be very careful about how that information is distributed and making sure that people are aware of where they are. And finally, talking to funding sources about how they can be helped. And I know that Senator Schumer has been very active in the current bill to make sure there is money planned for nonprofits and for the arts and for social service organizations. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk about transitions and some of the concerns that we have. And one of those is, and this is much less enlightening, or I shouldn't say that, much less inspiring than the prior speakers, but these are issues that you need to know as a manager or as a board member or as an employee of a not-for-profit. The going concern question, one of the things we do look at now in our reviews of audits is there a going concern exception to the opinion? What this means is that the auditor is concerned that this organization may not survive another year. Our expectation is that that issue, if raised by auditors, will be addressed by the board and addressed by management, and that they can explain how they intend to mitigate the problem and the auditor has to say, can it be successfully implemented? And I know Tanuja has had a lot of experience in strategic planning and risk assessment and governance. I think it's important to make sure that on your board there are people who are aware of how these problems are addressed and how to make sure you have a plan going forward. Management letters also for weaknesses in internal control. Again, the temptation is in a very difficult situation is to let your control systems not be as robust, but this is a period of significant risk for those areas as well. Walter, next slide, please. Another boring but important issue is insurance. You want to make sure in this time of transitions that the indemnification provisions in your bylaws provide protection for your board members, that you thought about coverage needs, cost limits, and risks, and that your directors and officers have appropriate insurance. Remember that most of your directors are volunteers, and in our view, the volunteer director system is a very important part of what makes charities successful in New York State. And that means you should not let them go bare. You should make sure that they have sufficient coverage for both the direct cost of the directors and also for indemnification. The other issue is general liability and making sure, I guess we're all past the epidemic exceptions. Whatever insurance you had, if there's an epidemic exception, we're going to see fights about that over the next 20 years. But looking at what kind of protection your organization has, and finally property casualty, making sure that the organization is protected. Next slide, please. Next issue is the use of endowments and institutional funds. And one of the challenges here, the Charities Bureau has the legal responsibility of making sure that people invest their funds, that nonprofit organizations invest their institutional funds wisely, spend them wisely, and that money that is in endowments, if you're fortunate enough to have an endowment, is used consistent with the terms of the endowment. And we've seen some charitable organizations say, well, we're going to borrow from the endowment. And in the law, that concept doesn't exist. The board has to make a conscious decision to appropriate funds. And in the past, there was what's called the 7% fair market value rule. They create a rebuttable presumption of imprudence. Now, in the time of a pandemic and the extreme conditions that exist, it is not unreasonable to say that 7% rebuttable presumption is no longer reasonable. But we see organizations that do appropriate more money from their funds, and you have to have board minutes that reflect what you thought about those issues, what it's going to be used for, what its purposes are, and what the alternatives are. So it's not to say that you shouldn't take money from your endowment for current expenses. It's to say if you do that, it should be a considered board decision and not just people writing checks off the bank account for that. The endowments and gift instruments, again, here the issue is if you are going to spend money that someone has given for a permanent endowment, that you tell them what your plan is and get their support. And then the next issue is restricted gifts, and one of the issues here is what kinds of records do you keep of the gifts that you have received. And what we're finding, and this is more in more traditional institutions like educational institutions, that organizations don't necessarily know what the restrictions are or how they can use them. And so in your treasurer's office or your CFO, you should have a record of what gifts that are part of your endowments or restricted gifts were given for, what they're used for. What we found very interesting is that in a lot of cases, there's money that's available for your purposes, but no one has looked at those gift instruments in a very long time. So the Charities Bureau has the power with respect to restricted gifts under $100,000 and older than 20 years to give you authority to release those funds to spend on what the board believes is appropriate. And if it's less than 20 years or more than $100,000, the Supreme Court of New York has that power as well. And for any kind of money that's an endowment, if you can show that the purposes are no longer able to be achieved. We want to work with people on this. And we've had a number of requests over the last year where we've identified areas that didn't need judicial approval because the nature of the grant or the gift was such it would allow the expenditure that the board was contemplating. And of course, all this is for organizations that actually have endowments or they have significant institutional funds. Next slide, please, Walter. One of the next issues that you should know about with respect to the Charities Bureau is that we launched an e-filing option for the annual filing, that is the CHAR 500, the IRS 990, and the audit reports with the Charities Bureau. And this is especially important this year because this past year, because most of our staff were not allowed to work on site. And so we encountered significant delays in the over 70,000 filings that we get every year. You may have noticed that it took us a while to cash the checks, took us a while to post the reports because that process until 2020 was almost entirely paper. And so required the envelopes be opened, the documents be taken out, the cover sheets be addressed, that they be scanned. And so that was a significant challenge. With the e-filing option, we ask you to do it. Your filings get posted within 3 weeks. The process, we've worked very hard to make sure it's user-friendly. And it calculates the fees and lets you do e-signatures and gives you the status submissions right away. And we expect within the next 18 months to have that as a mandatory arrangement, but we think there are significant advantages to using it even now as it's voluntary. Next slide, please. And this is just a slide that shows our online form. Okay. And then next slide, please, Walter. We're very proud of the hard work that our staff has put into making sure that we have current information, which is guidance documents for not-for-profit organizations in New York. One is the guidance on coronavirus resources. There's a series of other guidance documents, and we really would appreciate your work in sharing them with your board members, coming to our conferences, which we hold probably once every 2 months around the state, and letting us know what issues people are concerned about or care about that we need to address. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again, that the work that the nonprofit and charitable sector in New York does is huge. It makes a huge difference in both the life and the fairness of the state of New York. We are an international center for training people around the world in how to run nonprofit organizations, how to make a difference in social change, advocacy, and the arts. And we would like you to continue with that. And I see a note for Luana saying it's question time. So I'll ask you this slideshow is available to anyone who would like it. And if you have questions, you'll see my email address in the front of the presentation. So thank you very much, Claire, for this. And I think Luana, we're ready for questions. So the first question is, what are some of the biggest problems you've seen emerging with nonprofits in the wake of the pandemic? Unfortunately, the biggest one we've seen is survival. If you're on a board of an organization, how do you make the very hard decisions about, do we continue? What part of our mission do we continue? How do we support that mission financially? And do we need to think about working with others if we can't do it ourselves? And that's never easy. And it requires strategic thinking and a process at the board to assess risks and to respond to them. Okay. It's hard. The next question is, it's hard to plan a merger if you're in crisis. If you think it might be needed, how to prepare. It's important to remember, I think you're absolutely right in the focus of that question. There are other ways to affiliate with organizations besides a merger. And very often it makes sense to have a partnership or an affiliation where services are provided jointly, both to see if there's a good relationship and a fit between the organizations, and also if the merger is appropriate down the road to figure out how that's going to work and how the pieces are put together. But I think the key is focusing on your mission, focusing on the people who are your intended beneficiaries, and thinking about how you're going to continue that, whether it's as you are now, as a affiliation, or as a merger. Next question, Luana. What should board members be doing now? Okay, the first thing board members should be doing now is please don't give up the ship. As I say, it's tempting for some board members to say, I didn't sign up for this. But even more so now than ever, it's important for board members, who are mostly volunteers, to stay with the organization and to focus on the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of that organization, and to think about how the organization can contribute going forward to a world that's going to be very different in the next 5 years. And that includes asking questions of your executive leadership about finances, about equity, about commitments, and about what happens next. And so that strategic planning and thinking process, and making sure that you're current on the finances and current on the issues that management is facing. And sometimes in bad times, it's tempting to say, let's just let the executive director handle it. And the function of the board is really strategic. It's supposed to think about not just tomorrow, but far in the future. Next question is, how have you seen race equity issues affecting nonprofits? Okay. And this is a challenging question. I think there's a tremendous increase in awareness over the last 2 years on issues of race equity and the importance of both funders and social service organizations in responding to it. And I think one of the things about bringing up 1919 and 1920, in my opinion, is that after Woodrow Wilson left the presidency, there was a certain level of complacency in some quarters that things were going to get better. And in fact, what happened was that the KKK grew to its largest membership in the history of the country in the early 1920s. And part of that is the racial reaction to some advances for Black people in the country. And I do worry, once we've had our election and we have a new president, that people may say, well, we went to the polls, we voted on these issues, and we have a president who cares about them. I think it's very important for organizations to continue this fight and to push and to raise the issues and make sure that we talk about them. What lessons have you learned during the pandemic from your observation of what's going on with nonprofits now? How fragile, one issue is how fragile they are in economic terms, and how difficult it is in an organization when you face, whether it's you're a food bank and suddenly the demand is 3 times, or social services, or how do you get people to healthcare? There's a tremendous run up, and if you're a business, you may be able to borrow to build that expansion because there are profits that are going to come back. Very hard as a nonprofit to ramp up to meet those services, and governments, which you would expect to be stepping in and saying, we want you to take on this responsibility, in fact, has in many cases cut back. So you have a growth in demand for services, you have a need of the beneficiaries of your charity, and it's a significant risk to grow those services or to increase what you're going to do. And I think Jeremy raised that issue directly. And we want to pay our people more and get them out there, but how do we do that? I don't have a good answer for that. And I think it requires pushing the elected officials to say, yes, we recognize that this issue is really important. And you look at what Congress is doing now, and there's money for restaurants and money for a variety of other kinds of businesses, and the airlines got $20 billion from the federal government. Important to think about how we get money to the nonprofit organizations that provide so much of both social services, culture, and education in this country. And I see Luana's last question is, if you could give one piece of advice to a nonprofit leader now about, if you give one piece of advice to a nonprofit leader now about facing current challenges, what would that be? I guess I'm going to step back from that question. The role of the Charities Bureau is to make sure that people are using the benefit of New York's nonprofit laws to organize their nonprofits efficiently and effectively and to perform their missions. I think it's really important to keep your eye on what your mission of your organization is and what contribution you make to the greater community. And that's often very hard with respect to the day-to-day challenges you face, but there's a bigger picture out there. And with that, Claire, I think thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you all today. I really enjoyed the presentations before me, and I look forward to working, I hope, with the Better Business Bureau in the future.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was great. Really appreciate your presentation. And on behalf of BBB, I want to thank not only you, Jim, but Tanuja, Yancy, Sheena, Jeremy, Roderick, for all of your insights and the conversation. I also want to make sure that you're aware that Luana Lewis, our Senior VP of Programs, put this program together with the help of a lot of our board members and others. So I want to thank her, and I want to thank Walter, Senior VP of Operations, Don, Emmanuel, who helped with the IT today. Much appreciated. And of course, our BBB colleagues across the system who helped also to give visibility to the program, and all of you who are attending. Please evaluate today's program. As I said at the very beginning, we really take all of your comments to heart as we put together the next program. And I want to encourage you to save the date for March 24th. Sustainability Strategies and Tactics, another program which I just know you're going to get a lot out of. Everything that everyone talked about today, we have to keep building those bridges. There's a lot to do, but there's a lot of energy in the community right now to get it done. So with that, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank our symposium sponsors, our event supporters, and enjoy the rest of your day. And the program is now concluded. Thank you very much.